It began on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the air outside feels heavy with the promise of rain, but never follows through. Matthew and Emily had come for lunch. They arrived without the boys, saying they were at a friend's birthday party. I had roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and the apple tart Matthew used to love. The tart sat untouched on the counter for hours. We just finished the dishes when Emily leaned back in her chair, folded her hands neatly in her lap and said, "Zoya, have you ever thought about moving?" It wasn't the words that caught me. It was the tone, soft, almost kind, like she was offering me tea. "This house is big," she continued, her eyes scanning the dining room as if taking measurements. "And it must be a lot to manage on your own." I looked around the room. The wallpaper was a little faded in places, but it was the same one George and I had chosen 38 years ago. The table had a scratch near the end from when Matthew, at 10, had tried to carve his initials with a butter knife. I never sanded it out. "I manage fine," I said. Emily smiled in that way people do when they've already decided something for you. "Of course you do. But think how much easier it would be if you had a smaller place. Less to clean. Lower bills. And you could be closer to us." "Closer." Matthew said nothing. He ran a finger along the edge of his water glass. "I like my house," I replied. Came out more quietly than I intended. Emily didn't push that day. She just nodded, changed the subject to the new grocery store opening near them. But the seed had been planted. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the house breathe, the creak of the rafters, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hallway clock. The sounds had been my company for years. I knew where they came from, what they meant. The house was big, yes. But it wasn't empty. It was full of a life I had built. And I wasn't ready to leave it. Not yet. 2 weeks later they brought it up again. This time it was over the phone. Matthew called in the evening. His voice quick and bright, the way it gets when he's trying to keep things pleasant. "Hey Mom. Just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" I told him about the garden. How the roses were coming in early. How the hydrangeas might bloom twice this year. He made the right sounds, but I could tell he was only half listening. Then, casually, like he was asking if I needed milk from the store, he said, "Have you thought any more about what Emily mentioned?" Pause. "About what?" "About moving. Downsizing. It'd be a good change. You wouldn't have to worry about shoveling snow in winter, or fixing the roof if it leaks." I looked up at the ceiling. The roof hadn't leaked in over 20 years. George had seen to that himself one summer afternoon. His hand steady even as the ladder swayed slightly on the lawn. "I'm fine here," I said. He sighed, not loudly, but enough for me to hear. "I just think it'd be good for you. And it would make things easier for us too. We could see you more often if you lived closer." I wanted to ask why they needed my address to decide how often they visited. But I didn't. I never do. Instead I said, "The drive's not that far, Matthew. You know that." "It's not just that," he replied. "It's about making sure you're comfortable. You're not getting any younger." There it was. The gentle reminder that my age, my life, my home were now someone else's concern to manage. We spoke for a few more minutes about unimportant things. The weather, the boys' soccer practice, before hanging up. I stood in the kitchen after the call, the receiver still warm in my hand. Through the window, I could see the apple tree in the backyard. George planted it the year Matthew was born. Its branches were heavy with small green fruit, not ready yet, but promising. I thought about all the seasons I had watched that tree change. About the way the snow clung to its bare branches in winter, the blossoms that came so fast in spring you had to look twice to believe them. I thought about how no one told the tree it was too big, too old, too much to manage. That night, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were the things that didn't belong anywhere else. A quilt my mother made, a box of postcards from friends who had long since passed, George's fishing hat. I ran my hands over each one, letting the textures settle into my skin. If I left this house, where would these things go? Who would keep them and why? And I realized they weren't just asking me to leave a building. They were asking me to leave a language I had spent my whole life learning. The language of this place. The way the floor creaked near the pantry. The faint smell of cedar in the upstairs closet. The afternoon light on the west wall in July. And I wasn't ready to forget that language. Not for them. Not yet. It was late May when they came again, this time with the boys. I hadn't seen them in months. I made lemonade, set out oatmeal cookies, and opened the windows so the scent of lilac from the garden would drift in. The boys ran through the house like they used to, though I noticed their feet didn't pause on the stairs anymore. They no longer stopped to look at the framed photographs along the wall. Matthew at 5, Emily on their wedding day, the family trip to the coast where we all got sunburnt. Emily stayed in the kitchen with me while the boys played. She wore her "I'm just trying to help" face, all careful smiles and tilted head. "You've kept it lovely," she said, glancing around. "But I can't imagine keeping up with all this." I smiled politely. "It's not as much as you think. Once you've lived here as long as I have, the house keeps you as much as you keep it." She laughed, but her eyes were already moving from wall to wall, as if she were picturing them bare. Matthew came in a moment later, a glass of lemonade in his hand. "You know," he said, "there's a place opening near us. Townhouses. Really nice, with a little garden out back. We could go see one together." I set down the dish towel and looked at him. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because, well, this place is too much for you now. And it would be better if you were closer." "Better for who?" Yes. The question hung in the air. Emily glanced at Matthew. The boys' laughter carried faintly from the living room. "Better for everyone," he said finally. I didn't answer. I only turned back to the counter and started arranging the cookies on a plate. My hands moved without thought. 2 rows, 5 across, the way I've always done it. After they left, the house seemed louder than it had all day. Not with voices, but with the kind of sound you hear when you've been holding yourself still for too long. I walked through each room slowly. The living room with its sun-faded rug. The dining room where George once spilled an entire bowl of soup and laughed so hard he cried. The upstairs bedroom where the window still stuck in summer. And I wondered what it would be like for these rooms to stand without me. For someone else to fill them with furniture that didn't know our history. That night, I dreamed the house was on water. Floating. I could hear the waves slapping gently against the walls. Feel the floor sway under my feet. I stood in the kitchen while the windows opened and closed on their own, letting in the smell of salt and wood. When I woke, the quiet felt heavier than usual. I made tea, sat at the table, and thought about the boys' voices fading down the driveway the day before. And I realized something I hadn't before. They weren't asking me to move because they thought I couldn't manage the house. They were asking because they had already begun to imagine their lives without it, and without me in it. It was Matthew who called to tell me. "They're sending someone by to take a look at the house," he said. His voice quick, as if speed could make it casual. "Just to see what it might be worth. No pressure, Mom." I was silent long enough that he filled the gap himself. "It's just information. Doesn't mean you have to do anything." But I knew what it meant. It meant they had already decided the house could be sold. The only question now was when. The man came on a Thursday morning. Young, maybe mid-30s, wearing polished shoes that squeaked faintly on the wood floors. He walked through each room with a tablet in his hands, tapping notes while I followed. He asked about the roof, the plumbing, the age of the furnace. I answered, though my voice grew quieter with each response. In the living room, he stopped in front of the fireplace. "Is it functional?" I wanted to tell him how many winters we had sat here. George building fires so big the room smelled of pine for days. How Matthew used to lie on the rug with a blanket over his head, pretending he was camping in the woods. Instead I said, "Yes." Upstairs he measured the bedrooms. When we reached the smallest one, the room Matthew had as a boy, I almost told him not to bother. The shelves still held his old school books, his model airplanes. The curtains were the same blue check fabric I had sewn decades ago. "This could make a nice office," the man said, glancing around. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. When he left, I stood on the porch and watched him drive away. The house seemed to exhale, as if relieved to have him gone. Inside, the air was still. I moved from room to room, touching things I hadn't noticed in years. The smooth edge of the banister, the small dent in the kitchen doorway where George once bumped a ladder, the uneven tile near the sink. All of it spoke in a language only I could hear. That afternoon Matthew called again. So, he says the market's good right now. If you did decide to sell, you'd get a fair price. Probably more than fair. I let him talk, offering only small sounds in reply. When he finally asked what I thought, I said, I think the house is worth more to me than to anyone else. He didn't answer right away. Then softly, I just don't want you to be alone out there. But I was already alone. That was the part he didn't see, or didn't want to. After we hung up, I went outside. The lilacs were heavy with bloom, their scent spilling into the air like something too generous to keep to itself. I cut a handful and brought them inside, placing them in the old ceramic vase on the kitchen table. The purple blossoms filled the room. And I thought, if I had to leave, who would know to put them here? Who would remember that this is where they belong? I sat with that question until the light faded, knowing there was no answer that wouldn't hurt. I found them one afternoon when I came back from the market. 3 flattened cardboard boxes leaning against the wall in the hallway. Matthew had dropped them off earlier, though he hadn't called to tell me. There was a note tucked under the top one. Just in case you want to start sorting things. No rush. No rush. The words felt like an aftertaste. I left the boxes where they were for 2 days, stepping around them each time I went upstairs. They sat there quietly, like uninvited guests who had made themselves comfortable. On the 3rd day, I carried them into the dining room and laid them flat on the table. I pressed the folds into place, listening to the sharp crack of the cardboard giving shape. The sound seemed too loud in the still house. I started with the hallway closet. Old coats, most of them mine, a few of George's still hanging in the back. His brown wool one smelled faintly of cedar and something else. Something warm I couldn't name. I held it longer than necessary before folding it carefully into the box. Next were the kitchen cupboards. I found dishes I hadn't used in years. Mismatched teacups, a chipped platter from my mother, a soup tureen I'd used only once. Each item held its own small history. And for a moment I felt like I was dismantling more than just a house. By late afternoon, the first box was half full. I sat at the table, looking at it, feeling the weight of what it represented. If I kept going, each box would carry more than objects. They would carry proof that I had agreed, even silently, to their plan. That evening Matthew called. Did you see the boxes? Yes. Great. Just take your time. Maybe start with the stuff you know you won't need. I wanted to say, I don't know that. I wanted to tell him that even the smallest things, a teacup, a coat, a chipped plate, still felt necessary in ways he couldn't measure. But I said nothing. After we hung up, I took the coat back out of the box and hung it in the closet again. Then I carried the half-filled box to the hallway and slid it into the farthest corner, where I wouldn't have to see it. The other 2 boxes stayed flat on the dining table. The house felt quieter that night, though I knew it was only me, holding my breath, waiting for a decision I didn't want to make. Before bed, I wrote on a slip of paper and tucked it into the pocket of George's coat. Still here. I wasn't sure if the message was for him or for me. Matthew arrived alone this time, saying Emily had errands and the boys were busy with friends. He suggested we take a drive just to get some air. I knew where he was taking me before we even left the driveway. The road toward town was lined with budding maples, their leaves the tender green of early summer. We didn't talk much. I watched the fields blur by, the way the light shifted between open sky and patches of shadow. When he turned left instead of right at the old bakery, my stomach tightened. The townhouses were new, their siding still sharp and clean, small square gardens in front of each door. They looked neat, predictable. He pulled up in front of one and cut the engine. Just thought we could take a look, he said lightly. I stayed in the passenger seat, hands resting in my lap. They're nice inside, he added. 2 bedrooms, all on one level. No stairs. It would be easier for you. Easier for who? Yes. My voice was quiet, but it stayed in the air between us. He didn't answer right away. Mom, I'm just trying to help. This house, your house, it's too much. And you're out there by yourself. The words by yourself landed heavier than I expected. As if my solitude was something to be fixed, not chosen. I have my garden, I said. I have the neighbors. I have my life there. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his face. Not impatience exactly, but a kind of certainty. The certainty of someone who believes they know what's best for you because they can't imagine wanting what you have. We went inside. The rooms were spotless, the walls bare. Everything smelled faintly of fresh paint and new carpet. The windows were smaller than I liked, and the light came in at the wrong angle. It's fine, I said after a few minutes. Fine. Yes, fine. Just not mine. On the way back we didn't speak much. The silence wasn't hostile, but it had weight. When he dropped me off, he asked if I'd think about it. I told him I would, which was both true and untrue. Inside I stood in the entryway, looking down the long hallway toward the kitchen. The air held the faint scent of lilacs I'd brought in 2 days before. The floor creaked in the familiar way it always had when I stepped over the third board from the wall. This was not a perfect house. The paint in the upstairs bathroom was peeling, and the cellar door stuck when it rained. But every flaw belonged to me, and I belonged to it. That evening I walked through the garden, touching the leaves of each plant as I passed. The peonies were nearly ready to bloom. George's apple tree was heavy with green fruit. I thought about those townhouses, their little squares of soil out front, decorative, not lived in. And I knew, what they were offering wasn't more comfort. It was less life. It was Emily's idea to have a small get-together at my place that June. She said it would be good to open the house up a bit, let people enjoy the garden. I agreed, though I wasn't sure if it was meant for me or for them. The morning of the party, I was up early, walking through the garden with my pruning shears, trimming what needed trimming, gathering roses for the table. The air smelled of wet earth and early summer blooms. When they arrived, Emily went straight into arranging things, moving chairs, setting up folding tables, directing Matthew to bring boxes in from the car. I stood at the kitchen counter slicing lemons, feeling like a guest in my own preparation. By midday, the garden was full of people I didn't know well. Friends of theirs, neighbors from their side of town, couples who complimented the flowers but glanced at the house as if calculating square footage. Emily took a group on a little tour inside. I watched from the garden as they disappeared through the doorway, laughter and conversation fading into the rooms where George and I had lived our entire marriage. I wanted to follow them to make sure they didn't open the wrong drawers, didn't step into the small bedroom with the blue check curtains. But I stayed where I was, hands wrapped around a glass of lemonade gone warm. When they returned, Emily was smiling. "Everyone just loves the place," she said, as if I should feel flattered. Later, when the guests were gone and the chairs folded away, I walked through the house myself. There was no damage, nothing out of place. Just a lingering sense that something private had been handled without my permission. In the small bedroom, the curtains were open wider than I ever left them. The late light fell differently on the shelves, touching the spines of Matthew's old books. I closed the curtains halfway and sat on the bed. The quilt under my hands felt unchanged, but the air did not. That night, after they left, I stood in the doorway of each room, taking in the quiet. The party had left no mess, but it had left a mark. It wasn't the guests themselves. It was the way the house had been used for someone else's purpose. As if I were only holding it until they decided what to do with it. I thought of the cardboard boxes still in the hallway corner, waiting. And for the first time I realized they weren't just for packing. They were for erasing. I blew out the candle in the kitchen, leaving the house in darkness. The room seemed to settle around me again, as if to say, "We are still yours. For now." It was late afternoon when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. A bright, efficient voice introduced herself as Helen, a real estate agent working with Matthew and Emily. She said they'd given her my contact information so she could answer any questions I might have about the selling process. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. I haven't decided to sell, I said. There was a pause, just long enough for me to hear the faint click of a keyboard in the background. Of course, she replied. I'm just here to make things easier if you do decide. Matthew mentioned you might be ready for a smaller place soon. I looked around the kitchen as she spoke. The ceramic vase with yesterday's roses sat in the center of the table. The afternoon light fell across the counter where George used to sit peeling apples. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, measuring a life she knew nothing about. I'm not ready, I said. She sounded unfazed, as though my answer was just one step in a process she already understood. No problem. I'll check in next week. After I hung up, I stayed at the table for a long time, the phone still in my hand. It wasn't just that they'd spoken to an agent. It was that they hadn't told me. This was no longer a suggestion. This was a plan, and I was the last to be informed. That evening I went into the garden. The peonies had opened fully, heavy and fragrant, their petals spilling onto the soil. I cut a few and brought them inside, arranging them in the largest vase I had. The blooms leaned outward, claiming their space. I set them in the center of the dining table and lit a candle beside them, though it was still light outside. I needed the flame there, a small, steady declaration that the house was still lived in, still mine. Later I called Matthew. I didn't ask about the agent. Instead I asked about the boys, about Emily's work. His answers were short, distracted. When there was a pause, I said, "Don't make plans for me without me." He didn't respond right away. Then he said, "I just thought we were helping." "You weren't," I said. My voice was calm, but it landed like the closing of a door. We ended the call soon after. That night I couldn't sleep. I got up and walked through the house in the dark, my hand gliding along the walls as if memorizing their shape. In the living room, I sat in the armchair by the window and listened to the quiet. The house had its own way of breathing, the faint sigh of settling wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of leaves outside. I thought about how many years I had tended it, and how quickly others could imagine themselves inside it. And I knew then, keeping this house wasn't just about the walls and the garden and the memories. It was about refusing to let someone else write the ending for me. The next morning I found an envelope on my doorstep. No stamp, just my name written in Matthew's handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Mom, we really think this move would be best for you. We want you closer and it would give us peace of mind. We'll help with everything. Please think about it." Beneath his name, there was a line in Emily's neater script. "You'll love the new place once you see it as yours." I placed the letter on the kitchen table beside the vase of peonies. The flowers had begun to shed their petals, small pink half-moons scattering across the tablecloth. For a long time I just looked at it, the letter and the petals together, thinking how easily beauty can be mistaken for fragility. I made tea, sat down and read the note again. The words "peace of mind" stayed with me. I wondered whose peace they meant. I thought about all the years I had lived here without them worrying about me. George and I had managed storms, repairs, winters so cold the pipes froze, all without anyone's peace of mind to guide us. And yet now, my life seemed like a puzzle they wanted to rearrange so it would fit neatly on their shelf. I left the letter where it was and went outside to the garden. The morning air was cool, and the soil was damp from last night's rain. I knelt beside the roses, pulling weeds slowly, my hands steady in the earth. It struck me how different the garden felt from the conversation I'd been having with my family. Out here, nothing asked me to justify my place. Everything simply grew where it was planted, in its own time. By afternoon, the sun had warmed the grass. I came inside and found the letter still on the table. I picked it up, folded it once more, and slid it into the drawer where I keep old receipts and loose change. Not thrown away, just out of sight. That evening Nina called. She talked about her new curtains, the price of cherries, and a book she thought I'd like. I didn't mention the letter. When we hung up, I walked through the house, touching the things I loved. The smooth edge of the dining table, the cool brass of the doorknob to the study, the soft wear of the carpet on the stairs. I imagined packing them into boxes, labeling them, carrying them into a space where their history didn't belong. And I knew, with a clarity that felt almost physical, if I left this house, I would be leaving myself behind. I went back to the kitchen, blew out the candle beside the peonies, and watched the smoke rise, curling into the air like something carrying a message upward. It was a Thursday morning when Emily arrived without warning. I was in the garden, pulling the last of the weeds from around the peonies, when I heard the car door close. She came down the path with a bright smile, carrying a reusable grocery bag. "Thought I'd stop by," she said, holding it out. Inside were a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a jar of apricot jam. We went into the kitchen and she set the bag on the counter. "I had a meeting nearby," she explained. "I wanted to check in, see how you're doing. I made tea for both of us." She sat at the table, glancing around the room like she always did, as if taking inventory. "I hope you've been thinking about the move," she began, her tone gentle but deliberate. "Matthew and I just want what's best. You'd have less to worry about, and the boys could see you more often." I poured the tea and sat opposite her. "Emily, the boys see me when you bring them. That wouldn't change if I lived next door." She looked down at her cup, then back up at me. "It's not just about visits. It's about safety, comfort. You're alone here. What if something happened?" I let her words hang in the air. I thought of all the times safety and comfort were used as reasons to take something away. "This house isn't unsafe," I said. "It's mine." Her smile faltered, but she didn't back away. "It's just houses aren't meant to outlive the people in them. You'd be making it easier on everyone, including yourself." There it was. Making it easier on everyone. I sipped my tea slowly, tasting the faint bitterness of leaves left too long in the pot. "Emily, I know you mean well, but this house holds my life. I don't plan to give that away because it would be easier for someone else." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. We finished our tea without speaking much more. When she left, the bag of groceries stayed on the counter. I put the bread in the pantry, the cheese in the refrigerator, the jam on the shelf above the sink. Later, as I washed the cups, I saw her car pause at the end of the driveway before turning onto the road. I wondered if she was already on the phone with Matthew, telling him how the visit had gone. That evening, I lit a candle in the dining room. The peonies were nearly gone now, their petals scattered across the table like a quiet celebration no one had attended. I sat in the stillness, the small flame steady against the dim, and I thought maybe they were right about one thing. Houses don't outlive the people in them. But sometimes the people outlive the place they have in their own family. And I was beginning to see that clearly. It came on a Sunday evening, just after the sun had set. Matthew called, his voice more serious than usual. "Mom," he began, "we've found a buyer. They're willing to pay well above the asking price. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. We'd handle everything." I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the last light fade from the garden. "I haven't agreed to sell," I said. "I know," he replied quickly, "but this is the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice. You could have the money in your account in a month. You could move before winter." I could almost hear the relief in his voice, as though this plan, my uprooting, was a gift to him. "And if I say no?" "Yes." He hesitated. Then, "I guess we'd have to keep worrying." There was again worry, used like a rope, tugging me toward their vision of my life. "Matthew," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "do you want me closer or do you want the house gone?" He didn't answer right away. I imagined him standing in his kitchen, Emily nearby, both of them listening to the silence between us. Finally he said, "We just think it's time." I looked around the room. The candle I'd lit earlier flickered against the wall, sending a thin column of light upward. My tea sat cooling on the side table. Outside, the apple tree's branches were dark against the sky. "This house isn't ready to be without me," I said softly. "And I'm not ready to be without it." He exhaled into the phone. "I don't understand why you're making this so hard." "Because it's mine," I answered. "And keeping it is the easiest thing in the world for me." We ended the call soon after. No good night, no see you soon. Just the quiet click of the line closing. I sat there for a long time, feeling the stillness settle back into the house like a blanket. In that moment I knew I would not leave. Not for their peace of mind. Not for a promise of convenience. Not for the price on a piece of paper. Later I went into the hallway and took the cardboard boxes from the corner. I carried them into the shed, stacked them neatly, and closed the door. When I came back inside, the rooms felt warmer, as if they knew. This was my last answer to them. I would not say it twice. Autumn came early that year. The mornings were crisp enough for a shawl, and the apple tree in the garden bowed under the weight of its fruit. I spent one of those mornings baking a pie, the scent of cinnamon and butter curling through the rooms. The kitchen window was open, letting in a breeze that carried the sound of leaves scraping across the walk. No one had called in a while. Not Matthew. Not Emily. The silence between us had grown long, but it wasn't heavy anymore. Simply was. When the pie cooled, I set it on the dining table, beside a small vase of marigolds. The light fell across the wood in a way I'd seen hundreds of times but noticed anew that day, as if the house wanted to remind me it was still here, still holding me. I walked through each room slowly, my fingertips grazing the walls, the edges of furniture, the worn banister. I paused in George's study, still as he had left it years ago, and in the small blue-check bedroom where Matthew's childhood lingered in the air like the echo of laughter. Nothing in these rooms had been chosen for speed or convenience. Every mark, every imperfection had been earned. In the afternoon, I went into the garden. The last of the roses were fading, their petals soft and loose, but the chrysanthemums had come alive. Deep gold, rust, and crimson. I cut a few stems and brought them inside, their scent sharp and grounding. I thought about the cardboard boxes I'd moved to the shed, and how easy it would be for someone else to fill them if I weren't here. But I was here, and that mattered. Later, I sat by the front window with a cup of tea, watching the light shift as the sun lowered. This house had been my witness through every season, through loss and celebration, through the slow turning of years. It had held me when I was newly married and uncertain, when I was a mother learning patience, when I became a widow learning solitude. And now, it held me in this, the decision to stay. When the phone rang that evening, I let it go to the machine. Matthew's voice filled the room briefly. "Just checking in. Hope you're well." I smiled faintly and didn't pick up. Some replies are better left unsaid. As the day faded, I lit a single candle on the dining table. The flame trembled slightly in the draft from the kitchen, but it stayed lit. I took a slice of pie and sat down across from the empty chair. I ate slowly, tasting the apples, the cinnamon, the years. This house may not outlive me, but until my last day it will be mine. And that, I decided, is enough.